The Chevalier walked quickly through the palace. The voluminous rooms were filled with light, but eerily quiet. He moved faster. Sweat running down his forehead, he pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed. With each step of his high heel, he heard an echoing reminder. Late, late, late. When he finally reached the king's apartments, he took a moment to adjust his wig, luxuriating in a satisfying scratch, before he gently placed his long pinky fingernail to the solid wooden door. Silently, a tall usher bedecked in velvet trimmed with gold poked his head out. He assessed the Chevalier, not bothering to hide his disdain. Slowly, the servant opened the door, but not before whispering, "You're late," in a small, peevish voice. Obviously, thought the Chevalier, who rushed into the room desperate to join his peers before his absence was noted. Eyes darting back and forth, he quickly ascertained that the king was still abed. With enormous relief, he let out a stifled sigh that caused a few heads to turn in his direction. He particularly noted the Comte's icy glare. He wondered if he knew, if they all knew, why he was late. He'd awoken this morning to a loud banging on his door, and he'd stood there stunned as the insolent hotel staff quickly packed up his belongings and those of his wife before unceremoniously dumping them outside. His credit, it seemed, was all dried up. Standing in this sea of obsequious nobles, the Chevalier tried to subtly shuffle his position for a better view of the king's sun-crested bed, adorned with golden damask curtains. He needed Louis to notice him today. He needed the attention of the king, because only the king could dig him out of his financial black hole. As the curtains were pulled back, Louis XIV rose regally from his bed, not a hair out of place. He allowed a certain duke to help him into his fresh white shirt, brand new, to begin each day. And after he relieved himself in his gilded chamber pot, a lucky marquis proudly picked up the precious bowl and carried it away. The Chevalier stood at attention, hoping he'd be chosen next. He puffed out his chest, proudly displaying his distinctive light blue silk jacket, a symbol of the king's favor. But as he did so, a wave of his own officious scent wafted over his nose. His eyes popped open in horror. In the chaos of this morning, he'd forgotten to apply his scent. He racked his mind. Where was it? Had someone taken it? More precious than jewels, he'd commissioned his own personal perfume direct from the finest perfumier in Paris, made expressly for him. Embarrassed, the Chevalier squeezed his arms to his side, hoping none of his peers would notice his stench. Not that they smelled any better. The entire palace stank to high heavens. Even the gardens reeked of feces. But without his signature scent, he felt exposed. Fortunately, he'd secretly bathed last month while away on business. No one dared bathing in Versailles. One of the king's spies was sure to report it to His Majesty. Louis hated bathing. In truth, the Chevalier wasn't too fond himself. He knew that water spread disease and caused ill health, but his mistress had absolutely insisted. Just then, the king caught his eye and motioned for the anxious Chevalier to come forward, bidding him hold the royal hair comb. Intensely relieved, he rushed forward, making sure to point his toes with each step, keeping his movements nimble and light, just as his dance master had instructed him. He took his place next to the Sun King and felt restored by his glorious light. As long as he was near His Majesty, all would be well. As he stood still, basking in his own nobility, he felt a familiar itch running along his scalp. Silently he cursed. Lice. He'd only just rid himself of the vermin. But at least, he thought, he was allowed to hold His Majesty's exalted comb. Hey there, pithy listeners! Today we are investigating the Court of Versailles. And while we will touch on the building itself and the vast amount of history it represents, today we're really focusing on what life was like inside this majestic gilded cage. So Erica, do you know why it was called a gilded cage?
Not officially, but my guess is that there's so much gold.
Seriously? You don't know why it's called a cage?
Well, I figure because just like any other court, you're there at the leisure of the sovereign, so you can't exactly leave. It's gilded because of the gold and the mirrors, and that would be my guess. Am I right?
So you're totally right about the fact that it is very gilded, literally, in the sense that it is gold.
Sun King.
Louis XIV was the Sun King, self-proclaimed because he felt the world should revolve around him, which is just lovely. And it allowed for gold everywhere.
It's not like the court musicians really did much to dissuade that. Louis doing his ballets for him, in which he is the center of everything.
Yeah, him and his calves. So you're kind of right, but the cage bit is what we're going to focus on. Why was it a cage? And it's not just that they couldn't leave. It goes into so much more.
Oh my.
Let's just cover the basics first. Versailles, the building, began its life as a simple hunting lodge built in 1623 by Louis XIII, though it was quickly replaced by a small chateau. Very, very tasteful. A little upgrade. Louis XIII was an avid hunter and loved the grounds around this lodge, which was 12 miles outside of Paris. Seems easy today, but back then that was a bit of a jaunt. And while the king loved it, his courtiers did not. One noble described the lodge, quote, "It would not inspire vanity in even the simplest gentleman."
That's a statement. I also have heard that people felt like it was the backwater.
Oh, it was absolutely the sticks, especially at the beginning. Mm-hmm. It was absolutely the sticks.
And let's give good old Unlucky 13, some credit. Maybe that's why he liked it. No one else did, so, it was his escape from Paris, from court and the nobles.
Absolutely, it was an escape. And 13 didn't bring them along with him as much. I think 13 really did use this as, I'm leaving. You people settle yourselves. I'm out. No one knew better than Louis XIII how destructive nobles could be. France at this time was not the unified region that we think of today, different areas.
And has hardly ever been.
These huge chunks like we have today, up until really the 20th century.
Well, and the World Wars.
Yeah, it kind of makes people come together.
No, it just makes them draw treaty lines. That's all it does.
Okay, fair enough.
Come on now.
This is your area.
It's not.
Back away.
It's not this wonderful humanitarian coming together of
blessed
souls and good intentions. Come on now. That's
okay.
Not this podcast.
Fair. And Versailles was the place of a lot of these treaties being signed.
Indeed it was.
End of World War I, Treaty of Versailles, which was really just the beginning of World War II.
Indeed.
For those who are in the know. Here we are. Different areas, different laws, different lords, different languages. And so the great noblemen that ruled these large swaths of the country were almost independent from the king at the time. In fact, they didn't even have to pay the king's taxes. And this left the monarchy vulnerable and weak. So Louis XIII, along with his trusty and somewhat infamous advisor, Cardinal Richelieu, worked tirelessly throughout his reign to establish a, quote, royal monopoly of force.
Which sounds a whole lot like he put them in their place and maybe instituted those taxes and said, hey, we're not going to be doing this overthrowing the king situation.
Yeah, he was pretty aggressive. He basically told the defiant lords to denounce the use of their private armies and their public violence, and he made it clear that he was the ruler of France, not one of many.
So, give me the dates here. You haven't given me any dates, and I recognize that no one else enjoys them, but I do.
Okay, let me just go look them up for you then.
I just like to know what else is going around.
Louis XIII was king of France from 1610 until his death in 1643.
Oh, this is a whole lot earlier than I thought for some reason.
Because Versailles spans many, many, many generations, and we'll kind of talk about how...
I guess I thought he was the late 1600s.
No, he's early.
Got it.
So that is what Louis XIV, who would go on to make Versailles this famous palace that we know today, that's what he grew up with. These nobles kind of pushing against his father's rigidity. His father saw the little chateau and hunting lodge as a retreat, like you said. Even his queen, Anne of Austria, was forbidden to stay overnight. In fact, when an outbreak of smallpox threatened the lives of the royal family in Paris, Louis XIII hightailed it out of there with his son Louis XIV to the safety of this hunting lodge in Versailles, leaving queen/wife/mother to fend for herself.
Here's what I want to say, and it's probably a little controversial here.
Ooh.
Let's not leave me to die, number one.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, listen.
See you later.
A night or two alone, let me starfish out in that giant bed. That's what I want. Don't come bother me. Yes, I know they probably didn't sleep in the same bed. That wasn't really the royal custom. I get it. But leave me alone for a night, please. Thank you. Have fun at your hunting lodge.
Have a great time.
But don't leave me to die. That's not it.
That one's not cool. She's drawn a line in the sand there. Yeah, it was a tough relationship. We're not going to talk about Louis XIII and his queen very much, but I am going to say that Louis XIV was an unexpected or a, quote, divine miracle, so said his mother, because the royal couple, Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, had been married 23 years and experienced 4 stillbirths before the healthy Louis and then his younger brother Philippe were finally born. So they really treasured these children, and I could do a whole episode on how his mother feminized Philippe to the point of calling him her little girl. I mean, the woman clearly wanted a girl and didn't get one, and I'm very sorry, but it got weird.
Some historians have even said that they over-feminized Philippe
on purpose,
so that he wouldn't be a threat to Louis.
And in that sense, it worked out for them. So there you go.
In that sense, it did.
When Louis XIII died at age 41, Louis XIV was just 4 3/4, which, yeah, very specific. We need those 3/4. And he was then thrust into the role of king. And it's pretty hard to be the ruler of France when you're 5. Actually, not even 5. His mother acted as regent, but in his early years, the young king had to rely on advisors, especially his own little cardinal flunky, Cardinal Mazarin, who was a firm believer in the divine right of kings. And that was an ideology that Louis XIV would hold on to for the rest of his life.
Literally, King James, why did you do this to us?
God put me here. God wants me here. What I do is because of God. I get it all.
Don't get me wrong, Charlemagne had his own deal with that and the rest of the Holy Roman Emperors, but really, it was James who just cemented that.
I think it's power. Absolute power
corrupts absolutely.
There it is.
Wow, look at us.
During his minority, the nobles got a bit uppity again, which led to the Fronde Rebellion, a series of civil wars between 1648 and 1653. One event in particular really shaped Louis's view of the nobles for the rest of his life. In 1651, an 8-year-old Louis is sleeping soundly in his Parisian palace when he was awoken to violence. A mob had broken into the palace and was demanding to see the young king. They marched into his bedroom, and poor little Louis, with no one to protect him, had to actually pretend he was sleeping to save his life. The royal family did eventually manage to escape, but the boy king was traumatized. From that moment on, he saw Paris as a cesspit of danger.
So why wasn't anyone there to protect him? Were there no guards?
I didn't get those details.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that's weird.
I think that the guards had been taken out and the nobles, I don't know. I don't want to make any speculation. I'm sure he had a guard or two, but they were overtaken. And the mob went into his room and he was like, shh.
Yeah, that would absolutely terrify me too, as an 8-year-old. Yeah,
at 8 years old?
Yeah.
And especially when you've got this older cardinal breathing into your neck. You're the king because God loves you.
God, you could be such a creepy cardinal.
Oh, thank you. While the revolt did not succeed, in fact, the nobles were eventually put down and humiliated, completely brought to heel. It taught Louis from a very young age that the nobility was not to be trusted. To keep one's throne and one's head, a king must be in control of the peerage. And now we go to Versailles. Still just a hunting chateau, a dilapidated one at that, when in 1661, an 18-year-old Louis XIV attends a sumptuous festival hosted by Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of finances. This minister had a very luxurious home, and honestly, the word home isn't appropriate. It was just palatial. It was opulent, his gardens were incredible, and the party was sumptuous. Louis was impressed, very impressed, and he decided that since he was, God's rightful ruler here on Earth, he obviously needed something just like it, only better.
Yeah, but better.
In fact, Fouquet's palatial residence would greatly influence the scale and grandeur of Versailles' aesthetics, all that gilded stuff, the gold. Up until this event, it seems that Louis really didn't understand what exactly a palace could be, but now he knew. Thanks to Fouquet, he had a vision.
Which seems wrong, since he was the king.
They were living in the Louvre, which is a beautiful palace, but was older.
But it's also not gilded.
It's not gilded, and the Chateau Hunting Lodge was not gilded.
At the time.
I think his aesthetic was just gold. It came to life.
It's like Liberace just awoken.
He went to Vegas for the first time and saw the possibilities.
Got it.
He's going to build a grand palace, and killing two birds with one very expensive stone, he would then use this new home to demonstrate France's greatness to other nations while simultaneously keeping his rebellious and revolutionary nobles in their place, or really in his place.
You know what? It makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really be effective in the whole uprising thing or peeking in on 8-year-old kings if you're drunk all the time or
oh, that's not what it's gonna be. Just wait.
Secluded from your lands, your private armies,
there. Keep your friends close and your
enemies in your bed.
Uh-huh. I mean, to some extent that does work.
It kind of does.
Actually, Louis would keep his enemies' wives in his bed.
Which, again, effective.
Effective. Pillow talk. Dangerous.
Dangerous.
Ironically, Louis would eventually imprison the visionary Fouquet after the Minister of Finance bought himself an island, built himself a fortress, and amassed himself an army ready for battle. That did not work out for him. Ah, well.
No.
But the Palace of Versailles would go on, and it would go through many architects during its decades-long construction or re-envisioning. And as this isn't an architectural podcast, I won't go into great detail. But it was Louis Laveau, the first designer, who suggested incorporating the original chateau of Louis XIII. It would serve as the center of the grand courtyard, and in a surprisingly modern conception, Laveau was like, that's cool, let's combine the French and the Italian styles to accommodate this original building. And while at the time it was kind of referred to as a patchwork by some of the spicier nobles, I think most of us can agree that today the end result is pretty stunning.
Yes, I can just see the noble right now being like, I cannot believe they would choose the Italian style.
Erica, can you just quickly Google Versailles, look up the images, and tell me what you see?
Okay.
I mean, look at that view.
First of all, I didn't expect to see so much green. I know nothing technically is painted green, but it does feel green.
Yes. The gardens themselves were enormous. You just can't understand the magnitude of these gardens. And gardening in itself was not his hobby, but he did love to walk through the gardens, he being Louis XIV. It was a very sumptuous part of his presentation. I can afford to just throw money at dirt and make something happen.
His orange groves were really famous.
His orange groves were famous. The lighted fountains. I mean, the technology was actually pretty impressive for the time.
It is very French. There's a lot of twirls and swirls. It is whimsical. It's elegant.
It is whimsical. I think Versailles is what you think a palace should look like.
Yes, it is iconic.
It's not Rococo, not quite yet, but it will inspire the Rococo time period with all of the flounces and the trounces and the lace and the frills and the doilies. It's all coming.
And I can definitely see a huge crossover with this and then what you see in St. Petersburg a couple of decades later.
Mm-hmm.
It's no secret that that was the inspiration, but it is very interesting to see how click, copy, paste it is.
It's very click, copy, paste.
It is.
So Versailles, in the end, would prove itself, but the nobles weren't quite there yet. And while the exterior is stunning, it does have a lot of gilding. It has some very expensive marbles as the exterior. It has just window after window after window, and windows are expensive.
Do we have a count on how many windows are in there?
Oh, goodness. That's a thing for you to look up in your free time.
Oh, okay.
No, like now.
Oh, like now.
So the interior of the palace is just as exciting as the exterior, with a few very notable features. First, when it was originally envisioned, it had the ambassador's staircase for these grand receptions of foreign guests. It was eventually destroyed because they just wanted to make it even bigger, but it was awe-inspiring. Second, there was the Hall of Mirrors, a grand Baroque ballroom featuring an entire wall of 17 enormous windows that brought in the light, which bounced off of the matching 17 enormous mirrors that flooded the room and the court of the Sun King with a golden, divine glow.
Can you imagine? The lighting had to be just fantastic. You know everybody was living for it.
Oh, especially in the time
yes.
of candles. It was...
This is from PBS
All right, how many?
Versailles, which is capable of holding 20,000 people.
Just your closest friends and family.
Yeah. Yeah, it has 700 rooms, more than 2,000 windows, 1,250 chimneys, and 67 staircases.
So, this was quite the palace. It could hold a lot of people, and it was going to. It was built for these people to live there. Our Sun King used it as an absolute display of his wealth, as well as a nice play on his chosen name, the Sun King, because, you know,
all the planets circle around the sun.
And without it, there is no life on Earth. It's very clever. It's a lovely...
Is it clever, or is it just really narcissistic?
It is narcissistic. That's why I talked about his past, because I felt like it's important to see that he believed to his core, whether good or bad, that if he did not bring everyone to heel, and if he did not make himself a divine personage almost, that he wasn't doing his job. He didn't have his father to talk to. I mean, he was 4 3/4 when Dad died. So instead, he's going off of his mother, who's told him he is a divine miracle. And then he's going off of Cardinal Mazarin, who is telling him that as a king, God has put him here. He literally shines with God's light. That's what he grew up with. That would affect a person.
Do you know who this sounds like?
Abelard?
Ivan the Terrible.
Well, yeah. He's going to continue with this sun theme. The whole palace is just constantly covered in sunbursts that are, of course, gilded. And then he would decide that having his nobles living in Paris while he, the Sun King, lived in Versailles just wouldn't do. The planets needed to fall into his orbit. So here they come. At first, Louis used his newly built Sun Palace to promote the monarchy, or himself.
Never underestimate good branding, Caroline. Never underestimate.
The man was a propaganda genius. We're going to talk about that.
Marketing in general.
Louis hosted evening festivals in his endless gardens. And please don't think that this was some sort of a backyard barbecue. No. These events were so grand that Louis had engravings made to show off the opulence of these evening festivals. No expense was spared. No detail was overlooked, and these engravings were then printed and distributed not just through France, but all over Europe. And quickly, Mr. Marketing showed the entire Western world that Versailles was glorious, regal, sumptuous. It was everything and more.
So, I'm guessing that not only did it cost an inordinate amount of money to do this, there had to have been something more. Je ne sais quoi, if you will.
Yes, there was. More than 35,000 workers built the vast estate, and while one would think, or maybe hope, that building the king's palace would be a good construction gig, it wasn't. Nope. Louis, who spared no expense for these festivals, was an absolute miser when it came to construction. Money was thrown at the finishes, but almost none of it reached the laborers. Men earned 5 sous each day, which was enough to buy a single piece of bread, and a small one at that. There were no safety practices in place. Workers continually fell from scaffolding, suffered from heat exhaustion, and succumbed to widespread disease. Working 12-plus hours a day, there was no escape for these poor souls. In fact, 3 hospitals were built to accommodate the workers' injuries. And on average, 6 laborers died each week.
So I will have to impart something that my husband said recently, and Louis could have really used this. Rather have them curvy than scurvy. And he should have probably used some of those oranges to maybe, I don't know, bulk up his labor force.
He definitely felt that they were dispensable. They were...
disposable, even.
Disposable. That's even better. So the workers did try to go on strike, but Louis was heartless. When a group of bereaved family members spoke out against the laborers' working conditions and claimed their loved ones had died due to negligence, Louis just had them all imprisoned. He had no tolerance for delays of any kind.
Well, ugh.
He is a divine monarch, and therefore anything he says is godly.
Is God's will. But also, like, how cringe. Like, come on, dude.
I'm gonna have an entirely marble room with a gilded toilet seat, but don't bother me with your pieces of bread.
And your tears because your family member died. How dare you?
Yeah.
It's not like this was a quick project.
No. He didn't like delays, but it took decades. And as I said, it went through, I think, 7 architects at various times. Almost his entire reign to finish. And Louis would actually end up reigning on the throne for 72 years. It was only in the last 30 years that Versailles was kind of a complete situation. So 25 plus years.
It's easy to reign 72 years when you start at age 4.
It's not easy. It's just manageable.
Doable, yeah.
Honestly, the first half was probably the harder part because when you're 4, people like to steal things from you.
And how long has good old Queen Lizzie been on the throne? She just had her
Jubilee.
Yeah.
So Louis saw Versailles as his seat of power within the first few years of construction. He had a plan. But the court didn't move there until 14 years later in 1682. And Louis was most definitely playing the long game because he had the time. By 1687, Versailles was now the de facto capital of France. Paris was out, Versailles was in.
He didn't know that he was playing the long game necessarily. He didn't know that he had 72 years, so that's a long time to be dee-dawdling around.
But he wasn't starting at 40. He was 18 and vibrant and full of life.
Yeah, and no one at 18 thinks they're gonna die, yeah.
They're invincible. And he was told that he was a divine miracle and therefore probably felt he wouldn't die.
I guess that's true. Back up a minute. Mm-hmm. How exactly did the court move in? It's not like there's 2 men in a truck to haul them around.
That's a good question.
I want to know the pragmatic system of how this happened because obviously there are rooms for them to sleep in and eat in, but did they have to, like, pay a mess bill?
Ooh, actually, yeah, they kind of did. It's very similar.
Fascinating.
So before Versailles, the royal family lived in the Louvre Palace, which is now home to some of the greatest art in the world, and a polarizing glass pyramid that feels out of place, but I digress.
Okay. Does feel out of place. Thank God someone else says it.
I think it's beautiful. It's in the wrong spot. When the royal family lived and ruled in Paris, the nobles had their own homes nearby. They could attend the king, be seen at functions, and then go home to their own houses with their own families and either spend time together as a loving family or, more dangerously, foment rebellion, whichever one they chose. Nobles also left Paris often to visit their country estates, the seats of their own wealth and power, and that gave them even more opportunity to create problems. Louis, who, as we said, grew up during a time of rebellious nobility, had a vision. He wanted all of his nobles, both friend and foe, under his thumb or even under his roof. He expected all of them to uproot their lives and move to the country, to the sticks. And while today this is an easy jaunt via car or train, back then it was not an easy commute. And therefore, the palace itself was so large it could house a lot of his ministers and nobles.
20,000 of them.
Yeah, it wouldn't house that many. It would house about 5,000 people. But, you could stuff 20,000 bodies in there.
I could have a party for 20,000 people.
Exactly. His favorites and those of highest rank, and no, those were not exactly the same thing, were given apartments within the palace. So good news, you live near the king. Bad news, you live really near the king.
So what I want to know is, how big are these apartments? How many square feet are we talking?
Not that much. You got to bring your servants.
Not that much.
You were given a bedroom and like a living area. I think you could bring your own furniture and things for them, but it's not a lot of privacy.
You hear about such and such has an apartment at Kensington Palace, but there are 27 rooms.
I don't think these nobles are getting 27 rooms. Louis is getting 27 rooms.
Okay, fair.
But no, you got a place to sleep.
Okay.
And maybe a receiving room, depending on your status.
I better have a receiving room, Louis.
Better. But there were many that didn't get provided accommodation. They had to find it elsewhere. And so the once small village of Versailles was completely razed to the ground and rebuilt to include the royal residence and lots of townhomes for the nobles. Louis would actually give out grants for people to be allowed to build a townhome within the area of Versailles. And if you didn't get one of those, you could go to a hotel.
But what happened to the regular people in the village? They just had to up and leave? Did they get any kind of compensation for this gentrification of their village?
No, they got 5 sous a day, and they got a piece of bread and were told to get to work. No, they did not get any compensation.
God, I can't imagine why they rose up and cut people's heads off later.
That's 100 years later, just wait. But they did...
It's gotta start somewhere, Caroline. It's gotta start somewhere.
Yeah. It was not great for the city of Versailles originally, the town of Versailles, but I think in the long run it did bring a lot of money because all the nobles came and they had to, it built up. But for the nobles, things got super expensive super quickly. So eventually they were actually folks that were titled the Gallopers, nicknamed thus for their continual travel back and forth from Paris to Versailles. These were the nobles that couldn't afford to move, but still desired or really needed to be near the king.
First of all, you haven't told us how far to gallop to and from.
It would be 12 miles. So I think if they were going to...
terrible.
Via horseback every morning and every night to then start again the next day. And they had to be there by 8 sharp.
Okay, never mind.
How long would it take? Let me see.
I retract that statement.
It takes a horse 5 hours to travel 20 miles.
So what, 3.5, 4?
So we're looking at 3 hours of heavy riding each way.
Yeah, it couldn't be me.
And a carriage would take longer.
It couldn't be me.
Mm-mm.
I can understand why people would need to be there because of their interests, but there was obviously a desire to be there too.
I don't know if it was a desire. I don't know that they wanted to spend their day going back and forth, but they had to be there because Louis XIV controlled the purse strings of France. And all of the nobles needed him to grant them favors. Louis XIII had kind of reined in a lot of the power of the nobility. And so now they had requests of the king. Hey, can you help me with this? Can you figure out that? Can you grant me the ability to do this? But rather than receiving these requests via written proposals and then weighing them based on merit, Louis had a special criteria. You had to spend time in his presence. He had to see you. If not, when you would ask him for something, he would answer with, but we never see you, or we don't even know you.
You know who that sounds like?
Who?
My grandmother.
But we never see you at our Christmas events.
Mm-hmm. My grandmother had a book she would write in, and she would keep tally of who would call her. And so...
That's brilliant. I might start doing that.
Oh, she was very brilliant. But also, I think it was pretty shrewd.
So she had her own royal we.
Of course she had the royal we.
It's a choice. It's a good one. I like it.
I actually, in my presentation for my capstone, that was my biggest... That was my biggest critique. They were like, you've got to stop using the royal we. And I was like, we can't.
We can't. We are too busy with oneself. So the nobles suddenly found themselves trapped, and this is where we get the idea of the cage. If they wanted anything, a ministry position, a loan, a grant, anything, they had to put in the face time at court. And this meant they couldn't just visit their country seats. That was far too much time away from His Majesty's presence. In fact, they couldn't even risk being late for the king's daily grande entrée, his waking up time.
A thrilling sight, I'm sure. I know I look like absolutely the glowing, radiating sun in the morning.
Mm-hmm. It was the most important part of the day. It was a ceremony, the King's Levee. At 8 a.m. precisely, the curtains of his state bed were drawn back to reveal the sleeping Sun King. This doesn't necessarily mean that he slept there, but like his nobles, he also had to stay on schedule.
Even the King of France needs an alarm clock.
It's an interesting thing to consider that this gilded cage at Versailles kept the nobles on their toes, sometimes literally because dance lessons were required. But the strict schedule of Versailles also meant that Louis's life and his time were very constricted. He believed genuinely that he owed himself completely to France and to the public. And so he made his entire existence a spectacle. It gave him control, yes, but it also controlled him.
Yeah, but is that... I feel like that had to be his personality type, so I don't know that it was as much of a punishment as we would think of.
I can see that, and I certainly think that his predecessors did not agree with this plan, and that it caused a lot of problems. Versailles didn't last past Louis XIV in the same way because Louis XV and Louis XVI wanted privacy. They were like, I don't want to do this. And I'm the king.
And how dare they?
So it kind of fell away.
It did fall away, but also I can definitely see how someone who had these ideas of grandeur would need such a rigorous schedule to maintain those ideas and that sense of reality.
Yeah.
Because if you didn't have that, then are you as divine as you're thinking that you are? Or believing that you are?
Believing, yeah. So let's examine his daily existence. First,
tell me more.
He was greeted by his most trusted advisor and really his closest and truest friend, his valet, Alexander Bontemps. This guy had unprecedented access to the Sun King and would be an interesting podcast subject, but that's not what we're doing today. Then he received his daily checkup from the royal physician.
I do not want to see a doctor every day. Why?
First thing. After that, his full chamber pot would be emptied by one of his lucky nobles. Yes, they all wanted to be the person to clear away the king's waste. And then, my favorite bit, he would be greeted by his childhood nurse, who would come in and give him a special good morning kiss.
Weird for an adult, but also this is probably the only motherly influence that he had, because Anne of Austria would have been figurehead, not parent.
I think she was more parent than you might expect because, again, he was such a divine miracle. She really wanted a child and it took so long.
Was she a divine miracle or did she go to some priest who had sex with her and said it was a divine miracle?
Ooh, I don't know. I like that thought, though.
You know good and well that has happened in history time and again. You go to these...
That's why Elizabeth II won't allow her DNA to be looked into.
Yeah, you know good and well they go to these fertility monasteries where you pray about getting pregnant. I mean, come on now.
I am not going to dive into that.
Whatever.
But I see you. After this lovely good morning kiss, one lucky noble would help him into his shirt, while others would assist him with his dressing, his shaving, his drinking, and his eating, and everybody else would watch. At the court of Versailles, within this gilded cage, even the most menial tasks became part of a larger ceremony, or a larger performance. Everything was done to display wealth, authority, and of course, piety. Louis XIV was a very devout Catholic, and he attended Mass every day at 10 a.m. Let's just go over his schedule first. At 8 a.m., some sources say 8:30, so hard to say, the king is awoken, washed, not a bath, because that would be dangerous.
Yeah, your oil would be gone and you'd be susceptible to sickness, yeah.
Your essence would be washed away. So just a damp washcloth, then he was dressed, combed, and shaved while 100 plus nobles watched. He then ate breakfast, again on display, just him sitting there eating breakfast with 100 plus men watching him. At 10 a.m., he had Mass. To get there, he would walk through the Hall of Mirrors to reach his personal chapel. And it was during this walk that every noble would try to catch his ear, discussing political or financial matters as he made his way through the gilded room. Thus, if you approached him to request a favor, but he hadn't seen you during the morning regimen, he would respond, "We don't even know you."
fair.
You weren't here for my rising.
How dare you dump my chamber pot?
You didn't watch me take my morning constitutional. Where have you been? At 11 a.m., Louis went back to his apartments to conduct council meetings. All 7 days of the week were divided up based on a very strict schedule between finance, religion, state, and international affairs.
No rest for the wicked or weary.
I like the wicked. At 1 p.m., he lunched privately in his bedchamber. This was his only alone time. That's an hour. At 2 p.m., he partook in leisure activities such as walking, riding, hunting, and he really enjoyed carriage rides through his gardens, which who can blame him?
I can't.
And of course, all the nobles had to attend upon him at this time. At 6 p.m., he did paperwork, often in Mademoiselle de Maintenon's apartments, and that was his secret wife.
All right. Secret wife. I feel like there's an explanation coming because I know he had actual wives.
He did have actual wives. He did have a queen. But later on in life, things changed. So the secret wife was originally a widow who became friends with one of his earlier mistresses. She actually was kind of a governess for his illegitimate children until he actually legitimized the children. And so she became a royal governess, Mademoiselle de Maintenon. And then he eventually gave her a title, the Marquis. So Marquis de Maintenon, for being so good to his children. And then, scandalously, she actually ousted her friend / his mistress to become the mistress herself. And even Louis's actual wife, Queen Maria Therese, liked her much better than the fallen mistress. But back to the marriage. Okay,
Wait,
wife
so
died.
he was a bigamist. Was he married to her?
No, he wasn't a bigamist.
Whew.
He just had lots of mistresses, and he had Queen Maria Therese as his wife. But when his queen died, he secretly married Mademoiselle de Maintenon in a private ceremony. Because of the vast differences in their social standings, it was a morganatic marriage, meaning she wasn't queen, and he didn't acknowledge her as a wife, but they were still married. No official documentation exists. Anyway, 6 p.m., he spent time with his friend, advisor, and morganatic wife while reading documents, etc. During this time, the nobles were not off the hook. His eldest son, the Dauphin, was left to entertain the courtiers with music, games, hopefully some gambling wherein they became even more indebted to the royal crown. So just because Louis wasn't around doesn't mean the nobles were free to leave. At 10 p.m., the royal family dined together. I have heartburn thinking about a lavish multi-course meal at 10 p.m.
Who is awake? Who is awake at 10 p.m.?
Oh, sweetie, that's sad.
If it were not for you, I would be in bed.
I know.
I'd be in bed at 7:30 reading my book or writing something or doing my stuff and then be asleep by 9.
Then you would not have done well at the Palace of Versailles.
I would not. You know, I really don't think I would.
Because while he ate, they had to stand there watching.
Well, when did they eat?
Stand there watching. It was actually a bit of an issue. While the king did provide some courtiers with lodging, no one was provided with food, so catering was brought in every day, which was a very costly affair considering how far into the sticks they were. Paying for food became part of the game of court life. High-standing nobles would often allow lower nobility to eat with them in exchange for some sort of a future favor. So you basically had to arrange for your own meals to be brought to the palace at a time when you were free to eat it. And of course...
A royal Uber Eats?
Oh, Ruber Eats. Mealtime relations were a very powerful aspect of Versailles' intrigue and networking. As to where they ate, I'm not quite sure, but I do know that they were standing to do so, because at Versailles, only the king and queen could sit in armchairs. The rest of the royal family were allowed chairs without armrests. Dukes and duchesses were allowed the use of a stool, but anyone below that, marquises, comtes, earls, viscounts, barons, chevaliers, esquires, etc., all forced to stand, even during the catered meals.
Look at our traditional dining room sets today. There are 2 that have armrests, and then the rest of the 6, if you're in a traditional 8, have no armrests.
That's true, but those are chairs, and these people didn't.
Right. They were on stools or chairs with no armrests.
No, they had nowhere to sit all day. They were never allowed to sit within the boundary of Versailles.
What about when the king was not around? Could they, sit on the floor?
No, because those were the rules for all of Versailles. The chair situation was strictly observed throughout the entire palace, and if you broke a rule, you can be sure that someone would snitch on you.
Can you imagine the varicose veins of these folks?
No. It would be so painful, and it would create a lot of embarrassing problems.
Tell me more.
Let's let Louis finish his lie down first. So finally, Louis had a strict bedtime of 11:30. So he ate this enormous meal, everybody watched, and then he went right to bed to let the heartburn really just rise up and burn him from the inside. He was, after all, the Sun King. Courtiers...
I mean, that's terrible for digestion, but I respect a man who's got a schedule.
Strict bedtime, 11:30. And again, the courtiers all had to come and watch as he was undressed and then tucked into bed. So... if you were one of the gallopers, you had to be there by 8, and that's when he rose, so I'm thinking 7:30 to give yourself some extra time. And then, of course, he didn't get put to bed until 11:30. Let's say it finishes at midnight.
No.
You got a 3-hour ride home.
No. I would not be a galloper.
It does not work well. So that means that the nobles did not leave the king's presence, or that of his son, from 8:30 a.m. until 11:30 p.m. every day, 7 days a week. And most extraordinary, and you could set your clock to this schedule, it never wavered, it never faltered, and all the courtiers were required to follow along. It ruled their lives, kind of like a religion.
And it doesn't leave room for much else, does it?
It does not. That meant that they couldn't plan revolts, yes, but it also meant that they couldn't really attend to their duties beyond those of state. Couldn't travel home to check on their land holdings or their tenants. They couldn't really do the noble jobs. And that would eventually become very problematic for Louis XIV's great-great-great-grandson, Louis XVI. Speaking of, I want to clarify something before we go on here. First, a comment to the French monarchy. Find another flippin' name. Louis XIV had tons of legitimate and illegitimate children. But the Dauphin, his oldest son, was named...
Louis!
Of course. But he died before his father, and so he never held the throne. His son, another Louis, the Duke of Burgundy, also died before his grandfather, number 14. So, it was only his son, Louis, I mean seriously folks, who survived his great-grandfather to become Louis XV. And then, just to add insult to injury, Louis XV's eldest son, Louis, died before his father, leaving his firstborn son, holy crap, Louis, to inherit the throne, becoming Louis XVI. But if they had all survived each other in order, Louis XVI, the off-with-his-head last king of France, would actually have been Louis XIX. Ah, c'est la vie.
C'est la vie. I mean, be more original.
Think of something new. But let's go back to life at court. Louis' sister-in-law, the Duchess of Orleans, said, quote, I believe that the histories which will be written about this court after we are all gone will be better and more entertaining than any novel. And I am afraid that those who come after us will not be able to believe them and will think that they are just fairy tales.
I absolutely love Charlotte. She is fascinating in her own right.
She's a spitfire.
Yes, she is, and came from the Holy Roman Empire, where her father was an elector. It's just something we don't really delve into a whole lot.
We're not going to talk about her too much, the sister-in-law, but she did also have an affair with Louis.
Yes, she did.
Yes, she did. Well, Philippe was...
Who didn't?
It's fair. So Louis kept his courtiers in line by making them dance like marionettes to his ridiculous rules, and damn, were there a lot of them. Let's talk.
And you haven't gotten to them yet.
We're gonna get them. The chair situation we've already discussed, but in addition, all the nobles who wished to be in his favor needed to dance, and dance well. Louis XIV was an avid lover of ballet, in large part because he thought himself a very fine dancer, and also because ballet showed off his calves, which were, he felt, one of his best features. This also accounted for his love of high heels.
This is also where the red bottoms come in. He really enjoyed red bottom shoes, and so all of his nobles would do the same, and if you had red bottom shoes, you were super wealthy.
There you go.
Hello, Louboutin.
And you had heels. Women were given ballet flats, and the men got these fabulous heels.
And you know what? Sure, they had fabulous heels, but...
they had back pain.
You couldn't see my ballet flats underneath my skirt, so...
No, and you don't get to sit. So...
who's the real winner here?
Strong dancers impressed the king, so much so that aspiring nobles took dance lessons in their very limited spare time. Demand was so great that more than 200 dance schools, exclusively for nobles, were established in the 1660s. That's an enormous amount of dancing.
Holy cow.
That's just so much. They also learned to walk specially to avoid stepping on the elaborate costumes of the day. And as we saw in the beginning, no one was allowed to knock on the king's door. Instead, one must lightly scratch with their pinky fingernail. No one was allowed to open a door except for an usher. So if you needed to enter or leave a room, you were required to wait for someone, an usher, to attend you.
What am I supposed to do if I really gotta pee?
Oh, women and men were known to just pee where they stood because they had no other choice.
Oh, there is always a choice.
There was not.
There's not a potted plant?
I don't think so.
I would have found a potted plant.
I think a man could find a potted plant, but I'm not sure a woman could. With those skirts, how are you going to get that over that potted plant?
Oh, it's a pick and squat. It's not over the plant. Like,
I don't think they wanted to obviously pee themselves. It was supposed to be rather subtle.
You're gonna leave a puddle when you walk by.
Oh, there will be so many puddles. Just wait.
That has to do irreparable damage to their clothes.
I think it did, which is why they often only wore them once.
Ever?
Fashion was an enormous piece of control for Louis. He loved drama and flair, and this was reflected in his wardrobe. The man practically invented power dressing. First, he wanted France to be the fashion capital of the world. So as such, by royal edict, no one at Versailles could wear anything that wasn't made by a French manufacturer. If caught, the item would be taken and burned, and the noble would be heavily fined. Louis made the Versailles court synonymous with haute couture, which, France still feels that way today.
No, it still is today. Let's not devalue the man's legacy. It still is the haute couture.
It still is. But not the court. Just France.
Because it doesn't exist. But Paris, Paris is
haute
the
couture.
Fashion capital of the world.
Lace was everywhere. It showed wealth, and it was expensive. Silk adorned them all. Louis himself, as he never bathed, had to change multiple times a day due to his own stench. And his nobles were expected to do the same. Different outfits were required based on the activity of the moment. And each outfit cost a fortune. Many individual pieces of clothing cost as much as a modern-day sports car. Some full costumes were as expensive as a yacht.
Wow.
A yacht.
I want really expensive clothing, but not a yacht. I can't wear a yacht.
I would be too nervous to eat or drink, but again, they didn't rewear them.
My shoulders cannot support a yacht. I have too delicate a bone structure.
Louis loved fashion, yes, but he also loved control. And by forcing his nobles to spend enormous sums of money on their daily clothing...
How did this not bankrupt?
Just wait for me, good lord. By forcing the nobility to spend enormous sums of money on their daily clothing, he subtly bankrupted them on purpose. And once they ran out of money, they had to borrow it from him, which left them indebted and therefore even more pliable to his desires. He used fashion to show off his nobles' wealth while at the same time stripping it away from them.
Absolutely genius. Terrible for the economy. Go.
The man was very clever. One marquis commented, quote, "No one at Versailles was really rich because they'd spent their fortunes on all of this." He also used fashion as a carrot. He invented a uniform of sorts, blue coats lined in red with gold trim, and only 50 men at a time were allowed to wear this special coat. Louis loved the uniformity. It made his court look very splendid and visibly showed his control over the nobility. And it created hierarchical infighting amongst his nobles. They were far too busy stabbing each other in the back to earn one of these precious blue coats to have any time to plot against the king. And when a coated noble died, another would be given the honor based on Louis's preferences and whims.
He's basically a bedazzled spider spinning a great golden web.
And Louis didn't really want to leave his web. For the last 30 years of his reign, he only returned to Paris 8 times.
Dang.
And once Versailles was established as his power base, he never let it go. At its height, Versailles boasted more than 5,000 souls living firmly underneath his royal thumb.
Is that just nobles or like servants as well?
About 8,000 when you include ministers, servants. And those are his servants. The court nobles would have had their own as well.
Yikes.
It's just a lot of people.
It's a lot of people. And not a lot of toilets.
Oh, we're going to get there. Before Versailles, the court would move from castle to castle. So kings would require their nobles to house and feed the entire court, which was very expensive. It drained courtiers of their resources, but also allowed them to show off and show the monarch what they could present. It gave the monarchy the opportunity as well to present themselves to the entire country. And most importantly, and this is very important, it gave the servants time to clean the palace while the court was away.
And if they never leave the court,
it never gets cleaned.
Ugh.
As I've hinted a few times during this episode, life at Versailles might have looked glittery and gay. But looks, as they say, can be deceiving.
That's disgusting. Tell me more.
Well, let's start at the beginning. The original hunting lodge was built on marshland, which meant that from the get-go, it smelled. In summer, the stench worsened, giving off a sulfurous, rotten egg smell.
Smells like farts.
That lovely aroma was then compounded by the body odor of 5,000 plus people who never washed, wearing garments that were soaked in sweat and urine, amongst other things.
Nope.
Chamber pots were the toilets of the day, but with so many people living there, they would often overflow with waste. And as we learned, courtiers were frequently trapped in rooms with no way to exit and no chairs to sit in, so nobles and servants alike would simply go where they stood. Eleanor Herman writes in The Royal Art of Poison, quote, "Feces and urine were everywhere. Some courtiers didn't bother to look for a chamber pot, but just dropped their breeches and did their business. All of their business. On the staircase, in the hallway, or even in a fireplace."
No, thank you.
Great when that gets lit up. One visitor reports, quote, "Almost everywhere one sees a mass of excrement. One smells 1,000 unbearable stenches," unquote. So now, let's mix in some other fun aromas. Breath, for instance. Foul breath was a reality of life. There was no Colgate, no Crest. Instead, one might use their bacteria-ridden fingers to kind of pry out pieces of stale meat from between their teeth. Louis himself developed a fistula between his mouth and nose, which caused his own breath to smell like death. And his wife, Maria Theresa, reportedly had disgusting teeth by the young age of 22 when she married the king. And things just got worse from there.
This is awful.
Yes. A lack of dental hygiene was then combined with a lack of bathing. Versailles actually had running water and hundreds of bathtubs. But people of the time believed water spread disease, so most people were afraid to bathe. Louis himself notoriously only bathed 2, I have seen one source that says 3, times in his entire life. Take a moment to think about that. Deadly breath.
No.
Forever unwashed.
So why even bother with the bathtubs?
I'm so glad you asked. The baths were more for arousal than for cleaning.
Gross.
So let's mix that bodily fluid into things.
But you're in the bath, but not washing.
But wait, there's more. Versailles was not only teeming with smells, it was also teeming with lice. Lice infested not just the people, but even the furniture.
Gross.
And the glorious wigs that we associate with the time were not just aesthetic, they were pragmatic. Ridding one's hair of lice was incredibly challenging, especially when you'd be reinfected every time you walked past another person in court. Crammed together waiting for the king as he had his morning constitutional, the lice jumped from noble to noble, unbothered by the hierarchy of the court. So most men and women shaved their heads to avoid the vermin. Interestingly, this was the same practice used by the ancient Egyptians more than 2,000 years prior. And lice weren't the only thing that spread through the court. Syphilis, too, made the rounds. Louis himself liked women. A lot of them. And while you can't believe everything you see on TV, it can be assumed that the court definitely earned its reputation for lascivious and lustful behavior.
All right. Okay, Caroline. I get the point. I think we can stop. What? How is everyone not dead within a 2-year, 3-year time window? I mean, there had to have been something that counteracted this.
How were they not just dropping down from the smell?
Yeah.
Taken out by the smell?
No. How are they not getting the plague? How are they not just suffering from syphilis
They
all
are
the time?
suffering from syphilis, and they would use heavy makeup to cover the scars. And they weren't dropping dead. but I can see why you would think they might. Communicable diseases and all that jazz. They did, to help with the smells.
Well, feces and rats, plague.
It's bad, yeah. Perfume was a Band-Aid on top of a gaping wound. Sickly, sweet perfumes of various floral aromas were applied liberally each day, multiple times a day. One of Louis's mistresses is said to have bathed in the scented water of vanilla and used such heavy amounts of perfume that the king once commented on it. But she informed him it was the only way she could handle His Majesty's royal scent. Many nobles actually had their own personal scent created just for them by very famous perfumiers. But honestly, to my nose, that would just compound the odoriferous nature of court. Ammonia urine, putrid feces, moist sweat, rotting teeth, and sugary florals. Can you feel it?
What a combo.
It tickles the nose hairs, right?
Ugh, God, it tickles everything. Disgusting,
it's nasty. With such filth everywhere, looking clean, if not actually smelling clean, was a mark of wealth. Louis himself changed his white undershirts multiple times a day, never to be reworn. So that's 30 plus years of 3+ shirts a day.
3 times 7 times 52 times 30.
32,760. That's just accounting for the second half of his reign.
Holy cow.
Bed linens and undergarments were made of linen, which was a fabric that was believed to absorb dirt and grime.
False.
But at least washable. Because the fabulous outer garments couldn't be washed at all. Fur and bedazzled velvet do not mix well with water. Many had to be air dried. And of course, the wealthier you were, the more sets of clothing you owned. Remember, each one cost about as much as a Ferrari. The wealthiest nobles also never repeated outfits, but the poorer nobles, the ambitious upstarts, the gallopers, the bankrupted elite, well, they probably smelled the worst.
So, what happened to all of these clothes that didn't get worn again?
I hope that they went to a Salvation Army type situation, but I highly doubt it. My guess is that they were able to reuse the fabric
Or did
and
they
have
go
them
to the poorer relations?
The poorer relations. After you probably reused the fabric a few times and made it into a slightly different cut with different bedazzlements, I'm sure that they were sent off or just burned just out of spite. I don't know.
Or out of necessity because they were
so smelly.
Yeah, gross. Anyway.
So nasty. Before we wrap up Versailles, I want to take a few minutes to finish the arc of the Louis, because I think that we owe it to Louis XVI to find out what happened to him. Louis XIII built the hunting lodge. Louis XIV created this gilded cage. Louis XV, which was number 14's great-grandson, left the exterior alone, but he did add a ballroom, an opera house, a salon of Hercules, which sounds fabulous.
Yes, it does.
And he gave the king's apartments a lovely makeover. Though actually, due to excessive wars, he had no money. So most of these improvements were funded by his mistress, Madame du Barry. But number 15 didn't start his reign at Versailles. Like his great-grandfather, he became king at just 5 years old. For 7 years, Versailles lay vacant. They'd moved all this money and wealth, and all these businesses had opened, and then once Louis XIV died, everything just went bankrupt. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
But then, eventually, his regent, Philippe II, moved the court back to Versailles to escape his unpopular regency in Paris. But Louis XV was not Louis XIV. He couldn't control the nobles in the same way, and unlike his ancestor, he did not believe that he owed his life to the public. He wanted privacy, and so while the court moved back to the gilded cage, the nobility remained in Paris, only visiting Versailles for functions, etc. By the time Louis XVI came around, the system was failing. While they still expected nobles to follow their rigid schedule, the monarchs, Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, did not want the schedule. They wanted freedom. So after a while, the nobles became angry that they continued to show up, but the monarchy didn't. Marie Antoinette especially did not understand why this was such a big deal. She'd entered into some sort of an alternate universe when she moved to Versailles and never grasped the concept that Louis XIV had created. She wanted to plan enormous parties, but otherwise live very privately. In its heyday, Versailles was a web of power politics, hierarchy, etiquette, and fashion. Courtiers lived to follow the king. But once the commanding presence of Louis XIV was gone, his successors just couldn't keep up. In its final years, Versailles cost 10% of France's annual tax revenue.
That's a lot.
The French population struggled under the weight of heavy taxation, but then watched as their monarchs spent their hard-earned wages on daily clothing, the price of luxury vehicles. And that, combined with the expensive support of the American War of Independence...
Thanks.
Thank you, by the way. The government went bankrupt. When the revolution came, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette fled to Versailles, only to be accosted by the Women's March of May 5th, 1789. Thousands of women and men, protesting high prices and food scarcity, marched from the Parisian markets, all 12 miles to the resplendent Versailles. They took weapons from the city armory, besieged the palace, and compelled the royal family to return with them to Paris. After that, Versailles was immediately closed. In 1792, the new revolutionary government removed all the paintings and sculptures from the palace and sent them to the Louvre. In 1793, the monarchy was officially abolished and all of Versailles' priceless possessions were sold at auction. The monarchic symbol, the fleur-de-lis, and the Sun King symbol, were chiseled off of every surface. Empty buildings became storehouses for confiscated goods of other fleeing nobles, and the grand apartments were actually opened for public tours in 1793, so that the average Jane and Joe could see just how lavishly the dead king and queen had lived. Versailles went through many other stages. Napoleon himself couldn't afford to renovate the whole palace, but he did refurbish the entirely marble Grand Trianon, built for Louis XIV's mistress, as a little family retreat for the Bonapartes. It became a museum in 1830, was used for grand ceremonies such as Queen Victoria's state visit in 1855. During the Franco-Prussian War from 1870 to 71, the palace was occupied by the German army, and the Hall of Mirrors was turned into a military hospital. In the last part of the 1870s, the French Senate met within the gilded walls, and at the end of the 19th century, restoration efforts began. It was officially reopened in 1919 with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which we discussed, ended World War I, but sowed the seeds for World War II. Today, you can visit. It is owned by the French government and it's available for tours. You might even catch a whiff of Louis XIV's pungent odor as you walk along his daily route from his kingly apartments, through the grandiose Hall of Mirrors to his personal chapel. I'm fairly sure he would be appalled that commoners, such as ourselves, dressed in yoga pants and cargo shorts, dare to set foot within his gilded cage. But hey, at least we've showered.
Indeed.
Indeed.
There's no amount of Clorox that can get that smell out.
No, it does have a little musk smell, I think, now. But most of the furnishings were sold or auctioned off, but they've worked really hard to buy them back over time so that they have the original furnishings. It's very much like what Jacqueline Kennedy did for the White House. She tried to buy back all the furniture that had been given away over time.
You know, Paris and France and Versailles don't really hold any, like, I don't care to go.
I've been a few times, and I went for my honeymoon, and I love it.
Well, to each his own.
To each his own. I know.
I would be far more interested to go down to south of France and then do the Aquitaine and do
I can see
Provence and things like that. Go to Normandy. That's my era, though.
And that is Versailles. I hope that we have intrigued at least some people to go visit. Evidently, Erica won't be going soon. But it's stunning. It's beautiful. It's a part of history. It stinks. It's grotesque. People were peeing on their custom-made red-bottomed shoes because they weren't allowed to open a door by themselves. It's a very interesting point in history.
Somebody had to come up with a diaper or
Ooh,
something.
I don't know about that. If anyone knows of a diaper situation for the adults at Versailles, please do tell.
Yeah, because I'm not peeing on myself. I'm sorry.
No, that's nasty. I guess they would just be dehydrated and tried not to drink anything.
Yeah, that's true.
That probably did not help the smells.
No, and in Regency era, they would drink diuretics before a ball so they could pee at home and then be dehydrated at the ball, be skinny, and then not have to pee at someone else's house.
Wow. I love that. What forethought. It's like pre-gaming on a
whole new level. Thank you.
I bet they do that for the Oscars or something.
Also,
to fit in their dresses.
Thank you, Joe Wright, for putting that tidbit in the Pride and Prejudice director's cut. Thank you.
There you go. All right. And with that, I'm Caroline.
And I'm Erica. And we are pithily yours.
This episode is brought to you by the Pithy Chronicle, LLC. The Pithy Chronicle is intended for education, entertainment, and non-commercial purposes. Any views or opinions expressed in this podcast are personal and do not represent those of people, institutions, or organizations that the owner may or may not be associated with in a professional or personal capacity. While we offer lots of sarcasm, this podcast does not offer any advice or services. Listening to this podcast may induce fits of laughter, unexpected distraction, or uncontrollable rage at the subjects, hopefully not at us. We hope you learned something today. If not, so sorry. Please be advised we are not experts in the following fields: medical, legal, financial, technological, thermonuclear engineering, submarine warfare, neuroscience, or cat husbandry. Thanks for listening to our little disclaimer. Just covering our history-loving asses. Bye!